August 6, 1940. The fields near Chernivtsi, in a newly annexed slice of Soviet Ukraine, are sun-scorched and heavy with the promise of harvest. Here, amidst the wild grasses and forgotten cultivars, Nikolai Ivanovich Vavilov is doing what he was born to do, searching. At 52, he is a titan of botany, a global figure whose energy seems boundless. He moves with a purpose that has carried him across 5 continents, through deserts, mountains, and jungles. His eyes, accustomed to scanning landscapes for subtle variations in plant life, are focused on a stalk of wild rye. This expedition, like hundreds before it, is a hunt for genetic treasure, the resilient ancient ancestors of modern crops that hold the keys to agricultural survival. His colleagues work nearby, their canvas bags filling with specimens, each one a potential defense against drought, blight, or frost. The air is thick with the scent of dry earth and pollen. It is a scene of pure science, of hope being harvested from the soil. And then the black car appears, a smudge of authority against the rustic horizon, kicking up a plume of dust that settles on everything. The men who emerge are not scientists. They are from the NKVD, Stalin's secret police, their faces impassive, their dark uniforms absorbing the summer heat. There is no struggle, no shouted accusation, just a quiet, chillingly polite interruption of history. Nikolai Vavilov, the man who has dedicated his life to feeding the world, is placed under arrest. His crime? The official documents would later list absurdities: leadership of a non-existent peasants' labor party, espionage for foreign powers, and wrecking Soviet agriculture. But his real transgression was far more profound. He was guilty of believing in evidence. He was guilty of championing genetics. His crime was committing the truth. To understand the magnitude of this moment, we have to rewind, to see the world he was building. Vavilov wasn't just a collector, he was a visionary. He had conceived of and built the world's first global seed bank at the All-Union Institute of Plant Industry in Leningrad. It was a living library of planetary biodiversity, a Fort Knox of food. By 1940, it housed over 250,000 unique samples of seeds, roots, and fruits. To assemble it, he had led over 100 expeditions, becoming a modern-day agricultural Indiana Jones. In the highlands of Ethiopia, he found the origins of durum wheat, walking through fields his guides warned were protected by spirits. In the remote mountains of Afghanistan, a region so dangerous few Westerners had ever entered, he documented incredible diversity in fruits and nuts, narrowly escaping bandits. He charted the Andes, identifying the ancestral home of the potato. He traveled through Mexico, Central Asia, the Mediterranean, and East Asia, meticulously gathering and cataloging. Each seed was a packet of information, a story of coevolution between humans and plants written in DNA. He wasn't just collecting, he was reading the genetic history of civilization. His work culminated in a revolutionary theory: the centers of origin, specific geographic areas where cultivated plants first emerged and where their greatest genetic diversity could still be found. This wasn't an academic exercise. Vavilov saw the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. He understood that monoculture, the reliance on a few high-yield crops, was a fragile gamble. True food security, he argued, lay in diversity. A single disease could wipe out a nation's uniform wheat fields, but within his collection lay thousands of wheat varieties, some with natural resistance that could be bred into new, stronger crops. He was building a genetic shield for humanity against the famines he knew were inevitable. His institute in Leningrad was a beacon of global science, a place where researchers from around the world collaborated. He was a corresponding member of the Royal Society in London, a celebrated figure whose work was seen as fundamental to the future of the human race. But back in the Soviet Union, another force was rising: A poorly educated but politically savvy agronomist named Trofim Lysenko was peddling a dangerously seductive idea. He claimed that genetics, Vavilov's entire field, was a fraudulent bourgeois science. True socialist agriculture, Lysenko preached, could be achieved by re-educating plants. He argued that traits acquired during a plant's life could be passed down to its offspring, a Lamarckian idea long debunked by mainstream science. His methods were crude, like soaking seeds in freezing water, a process he called vernalization, and promising it would permanently make wheat a winter crop. To a desperate regime under Stalin, haunted by the catastrophic famines of the early 1930s that had killed millions, Lysenko's promises of immediate, miraculous results without the need for long-term methodical research were intoxicating. He was a political asset, a barefoot scientist who spoke the language of the proletariat and offered a unique Soviet solution. Vavilov, with his international acclaim and his insistence on empirical, evidence-based Mendelian genetics, became an obstacle. He was a constant, towering reminder that the truth could not be bent to fit ideology. So, on that August day, the system decided to remove him. As the NKVD car drove away, leaving his stunned colleagues in the field, the world's greatest protector of food security became a prisoner of the state he had tried so desperately to serve. His vast collection, humanity's insurance policy against starvation, was now leaderless. The world remained oblivious. Journals in London and New York continued to cite his work, unaware that its author was now in a cell in Moscow's infamous Lubyanka prison. The architect of food security had vanished, and the question that hung in the silent, terrified halls of Soviet science was terrifyingly simple. If they could erase a man of Vavilov's stature, who was safe? Following that chilling arrest, the system began its work not just on the man, but on his ideas. Nikolai Vavilov's life's work, the All-Union Institute of Plant Industry, became the central battleground in a war between scientific reality and political fantasy. His theory of the centers of origin was more than just a map. It was a profound insight into the mechanics of evolution and agriculture. Vavilov had demonstrated with overwhelming evidence gathered from every corner of the globe that the path to a stronger food supply was through genetic diversity. Think of it like this. If you want to build a stronger, more resilient structure, you need a vast supply of different materials: steel, wood, concrete, composites. You wouldn't build a skyscraper using only one type of brick. Vavilov's seed bank was that global supply of materials for the living architecture of our food system. He showed that wheat's greatest diversity, its ancestral home, was in the Fertile Crescent. If you needed wheat that could resist a new fungal rust, the highest probability of finding that genetic trait was by looking at the wild and ancient varieties from that region. The potato's center of origin was the Andes Mountains. There, you could find varieties that thrived in poor soil, at high altitudes, and in cold temperatures, traits that could save crops in other parts of the world. This was meticulous, evidence-based science. It required patience, international collaboration, and an acceptance of the complex laws of Mendelian genetics, which dictate how traits are passed down through genes. It was a science of humility, acknowledging that nature held answers that humans had to discover, not invent. This entire framework of thought was a direct threat to the cult of Trofim Lysenko. Lysenkoism was the antithesis of Vavilov's work. It was a doctrine of scientific brute force, perfectly aligned with the Stalinist belief that sheer willpower, guided by communist ideology, could reshape nature itself. Lysenko's central claim, the inheritance of acquired characteristics, was a scientific zombie, an idea that had been put to rest by decades of research but was now reanimated for political purposes. He argued that if you subjected a plant to a certain environment, its offspring would inherit the memory of that experience. He claimed that by planting seeds very close together, they would learn to cooperate selflessly in the spirit of socialist collectivism and not compete for resources. He infamously declared that a cuckoo could be born from a warbler's egg. It was magical thinking disguised as agricultural science. The reason it took hold was not because it worked. It was a catastrophic failure, but because it was politically useful. It rejected the foreign and bourgeois science of genetics, which Stalin and his ideologues viewed as fatalistic and contrary to the transformative power of the Soviet state. Genetics implied that organisms were constrained by their inherited traits. Lysenkoism promised that anything was possible, that a new Soviet man could create a new Soviet nature. It was a lie that the state desperately wanted to be true. The conflict came to a head in a series of chillingly public discussions that were, in reality, political show trials for ideas. At a 1936 conference, Vavilov and his supporters presented clear, experimental data refuting Lysenko's claims. They were shouted down. Lysenko, backed by the party, responded not with data, but with ideological accusations. He and his followers labeled genetics a fascist science, a tool of racists and imperialists. Scientists who defended Vavilov were accused of being saboteurs and wreckers, actively trying to undermine the Soviet food supply. The state-controlled newspaper Komsomol ran articles praising Lysenko as a patriotic hero, while vilifying Vavilov and his colleagues. The systemic pressure was immense. Denunciations were encouraged. Colleagues turned on each other to save their own careers or their own lives. A transcript from a 1939 conference reveals the terrifying atmosphere. When Vavilov tried to speak, he was heckled with cries of Mendelist Mordinist, a term that had become synonymous with enemy of the people. Lysenko's ally, Isak Present, a man with no scientific credentials but a masterful command of political rhetoric, orchestrated the attacks. He framed the debate as a class struggle. Vavilov and the geneticists were the elites, the ivory tower intellectuals, while Lysenko was the voice of the common farmer, the true practitioner. It was a brilliant and deadly piece of propaganda. Following these conferences, the purges began. Hundreds of geneticists were fired. Many were arrested, sent to the Gulag, or executed. Research programs were shut down. Textbooks were rewritten. An entire field of science was effectively outlawed in the Soviet Union. The very foundation of modern biology was declared a state crime. Vavilov, who had fought valiantly to defend scientific reason, was now its most high-profile victim. The system he served had decided that a convenient lie was more valuable than a complex truth. And this decision had consequences far beyond the prison walls. As Lysenko's unproven methods were forced upon collective farms across the country, crop yields plummeted. His theories led to agricultural practices that destroyed soil and wasted precious resources. The lie that was meant to solve famine was in fact creating it. The nation was being led into a biological dark age, guided by a charlatan, while the one man who held the real key to their salvation was being systematically broken. How could a nation so desperate for food, a nation that had already endured so much starvation, so willingly and violently reject the very science that could save it? The answer to how a nation could devour its own savior lies in the terrifying power of ideology to overwrite reality. For the Stalinist regime, maintaining political control was more important than feeding its people. Vavilov's science, based on universal, objective truths, was a threat to a system built on the principle that the party was the ultimate arbiter of truth. Once imprisoned, Nikolai Vavilov endured over 400 interrogation sessions, many lasting for hours. The NKVD transcripts read like a fever dream of bureaucratic cruelty. He was sleep-deprived, beaten, and relentlessly pressured to confess to his imaginary crimes. Yet, through it all, he refused to renounce his science. He defended genetics, defended his colleagues, and tried, even in the depths of Lubyanka prison, to explain the importance of his work to his tormentors. He was sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to 20 years in the Gulag. He was transferred to the brutal Saratov prison, a place where survival was a daily struggle. The world's leading expert on nutrition, the man who understood the intricate biology of every major food crop on the planet, was now systematically and deliberately starved. His letters to the head of the NKVD, Lavrentiy Beria, are heartbreaking. He doesn't beg for his freedom, but for the chance to continue his work, even from behind bars, to help his country. His pleas went unanswered. As Vavilov wasted away, his legacy was being protected in the most profound and tragic act of scientific devotion imaginable. Back in Leningrad, the city was besieged by the Nazi army. The 900-day siege of Leningrad was one of the darkest chapters of World War II. The city was cut off from all supplies. Food ran out. People ate wallpaper paste, leather, and eventually each other. Starvation and freezing temperatures claimed over 1 million civilian lives. Inside Vavilov's institute, a small group of his scientists guarded his life's work, the global seed collection. They were surrounded by tons of edible material. There were bags of rice, crates of potatoes, and countless jars of wheat, corn, and beans. It was one of the largest concentrations of food in the entire starving city. Yet, they made a pact. They would protect the collection at all costs. They understood what their government did not. This collection wasn't just food, it was the future. It was the genetic blueprint for decades of agricultural recovery, not just for the Soviet Union, but for the entire world. The stories are almost unbelievable in their heroism. Alexander Stochkin, a peanut specialist, died of starvation at his desk. Dmitry Ivanov, who managed the rice collection, starved to death surrounded by thousands of pounds of it. Lilia Rodina, the oat curator, did the same. In total, at least 11 of his colleagues chose to starve to death rather than consume a single seed from the collection they were tasked to protect. They meticulously boxed up the collection, moving it to the basement to protect it from German bombs and from ravenous rats, which they had to fend off even as their own bodies wasted away. They were living martyrs to the principle of scientific foresight, making the ultimate sacrifice to save a future they would never see, protecting the legacy of a man their own government was murdering. On January 26, 1943, Nikolai Vavilov died of dystrophy, the clinical term for starvation, in a Saratov prison hospital. His body was likely thrown into a mass grave. The official cause of death was listed as decline of cardiac activity. The irony is stomach-turning. He was starved to death by a system whose agricultural policies, based on the pseudoscience that replaced his work, would contribute to further food shortages and famines for years to come, most notably in China, which adopted Lysenko's methods with devastating results in the 1950s. It wasn't until after Stalin's death that Vavilov's name began to be cautiously resurrected. He was rehabilitated in the 1960s, his story slowly emerging from the shadows. Today, his work is the bedrock of modern agricultural genetics. His theories on the centers of origin are fundamental to how scientists search for useful traits to combat climate change and new diseases. Every major seed bank in the world, including the doomsday Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway, is a direct intellectual descendant of the institute he founded. His collection, saved by the sacrifice of his colleagues, has been used to breed countless new crop varieties that feed billions. His story is a brutal, undeniable testament to the fact that science and the pursuit of truth are not abstract ideals. They are acts of courage, often performed at immense personal cost. It forces us to confront the terrifying fragility of knowledge in the face of power. What does it say about our systems of governance, then and now, when the heroes who seek to nourish humanity are the very ones we allow to be sacrificed on the altar of political convenience? The seeds they saved continue to grow, a silent, living monument to a man and his followers who understood that some things are worth dying for so that others might live.